Since earliest times, humanity has been on the move. Some people move in research of new economic opportunities and horizons. Others move to escape armed conflict, poverty, persecution, terrorism, human rights violations. Still others move because of the effect of climate change and natural disasters. Many move indeed for a combination of these reasons. I am Hijrah Podcast, and this is Hijrah Podcast. This podcast is produced by IOM MENA Regional Office. Martin Russell is with me today to talk about diaspora engagement. He has trained, spoken, and written on diaspora engagement in Africa, Caribbean, Asia, Central and Latin America, Europe, MENA region, United Kingdom, and the United States. Hello, Martin. You are an expert on diaspora engagement. There is no set definition of diaspora. How will you define it?
A lot of organizations and a lot of policies and strategies really struggle with that issue of definition. And as I say, look, I come from a very small island, Ireland. So strategically, we wanted to have a very inclusive definition of our diaspora. Because when you talk about diaspora and why governments or organizations want to engage with them, the next question is, we're talking about diaspora capital here. So we have a working definition of diaspora capital that talks about issues of people, flows of people, ideas, connections across a city, organization, or a country. We're incredibly broad in terms of how I and my colleagues define diaspora. I would argue that companies have diasporas. Now, companies call it alumni, corporate alumni, but it's the same principle. So what we need to figure out for governments and organizations is what definition will actually work for them. And I'm a big believer, and a lot of the work that I do with IOM and different organizations is if you adopt an inclusive definition at the beginning, you're enabling yourself to design strategies or programs or projects that can actually attract the diversity of capital across your diaspora. And
talking about definition, what is the etymology of the word diaspora?
It's actually made up of two words, dia and spora. So it means the scattering of seeds. So two words, Greek origin. So diaspora.
Martin, how are migration and diaspora related?
When we talk about diaspora, a lot of people are still quite ambiguous on what we mean by it. And of course, it's related to migration. I have a joke line that I say migration and diaspora are like first cousins. They're related, but not the same in the sense that we need to figure out what that relationship is. If we're truly honest with ourselves and we think about, and we ask anybody to close their eyes and say the word migration and ask them what is the first picture that comes into their head, if they're being honest with us, it'll probably be of boats or of the young child on a beach in Turkey, despite all the positive things that migration brings to the world. So I see diaspora as an incredibly powerful opportunity for the debate on migration because we know they're related. And the way I like to frame it in my mind is that migration is the language of borders and identity, but diaspora is the language of belonging and affinity. It's softer, but in that softer framework, it's much more powerful. Nobody can give out with issues of belonging and affinity. It's depolitical. Right? And that's the beauty of diaspora engagement. So that relationship between migration and diaspora, we have to cultivate it and we have to promote it because diaspora can do a lot of good for the debate on migration. And that's where a podcast such as this and your previous work on talk shows is really important. When we talk about migration as being the language of borders and identity, people see migration as lines on a map. And I think that's very, very sensitive in today's age. So the way we see it is actually what's in your heart when you talk about diaspora.
I think that is very interesting to understand because migration and diaspora have the same path. And first they called migrants and then they called diaspora. This community is called diaspora. And in order to avoid to talk about migrants as only numbers and a line on the maps and to identify the destination countries or the country of origin as we call them and the hosting countries, which for the migrants, they called hosting countries, but then when the community becomes diaspora, it's not any longer a hosting country, it's their country, right? So they belong to two different countries. And when we stop talking about this community as migrants and we start talking as diaspora?
It's a difficult one because, migration causes diasporas, if you want to really simplify it, in the sense when people move abroad and when they get to the stage of a certain level of maturity within their community development, that's where they transition into that sense of diaspora. And, there was a great phrase by an academic many years ago, Gabriel Scheffer, who wrote a book on diaspora politics, but it was the 3 words after diaspora politics in the title that I think encapsulates what we're trying to achieve here. And he says it's about being at home abroad, right? And the connotations of home is incredibly powerful for a lot of people. And, we live in an age now where we should be celebrating hyphenated identities. It's the norm. There's no clinical point that you can say that you stop being a migrant and you become a member of a diaspora. And part of it is tied back to how you define diaspora for your type of engagement. A lot of people tie it into kids and next generation, and but let's not be flippant about this, right? Is it a case that you're trying to say is that when you buy a house and get married, you're a member of diaspora? No, the world doesn't work like that. And some people would argue that the minute that they go to another country and integrate to become a member of a diaspora. So the only way you will answer that for you or your country or your context or your organization is to ask them.
Where diaspora engagement is today?
It's a really tough and honest question that we have to ask now in the sector in terms of where diaspora engagement is. So what I would say is, do you want the good news first or the bad news first?
Well, let's start with the good news.
Right. The good news is that the level of interest from governments, civil society, international agencies and donors has never been higher on the topic. So that tells us something, that the sector is at a really important moment of opportunity. Whether we like it or not, the bad news is that most diaspora engagement does not work. And we have to acknowledge that. And what happens, we have a kind of a funny saying, is that most diaspora engagements are like fireworks. They go off in a blaze of glory, but kind of disappear within 6 to 12 months. So that's quite an interesting contradiction in the sense of the level of interest is growing exponentially, but yet the number of successes in the sector is quite static. So that tells us that we need to really think about how we're going about the work that we have been doing in the sector, and most importantly, the work that we're planning in the future in the sector. And there's bigger questions there about who should be leading this, who should be implementing this, who should be facilitating this, what is the role of government, is it civil society, and the relationships that need to be built to make that happen. So that's the good news and the bad news.
So that what can be done to make diaspora engagement work better?
Culture is really powerful in this. And I remember a great academic in Ireland who helped me incredibly when I was beginning, Professor Mark Boyle, who wrote a lot on diaspora. He said a line to me once. He said, "Look, Martin, diaspora engagement number 1 is culture. Diaspora engagement number 2 is culture. Diaspora engagement number 3 is culture. It's not that complicated." So I think when you begin to look at why these initiatives begin to struggle is that, sometimes they go for the economics too quickly. And I think also, you need to go out. There's a couple of fundamentals of diaspora engagement. You have to listen to your diaspora. You can't be telling your diaspora what you want from them. Figure out what you can give to them first. You also have to build networks that matter to them. So we have to tailor expectations and realities of what can be actually designed on the ground. But behind that, all those issues of capacity and staffing and finances and everything that goes into successful engagement, the lurking question in the background is, what is the role of government?
And do you think that there is a good example you can bring in about the role, the positive role of the government towards diaspora, and an example that it worked out pretty well?
Within the Irish model, what I'm most proud of is that we look after our vulnerable members of the Irish diaspora. We have a dual process to this. We want to engage our successful, but we want to support our most vulnerable members. So that's the Irish model that I think is important. India, I think, is just a phenomenal story to capture. And here's the reason. India only began diaspora engagement in the early 2000s in a systematic level. And it began from a relatively fragile position where there was a lot of issues of trust and lack of communication and probably transparency between the relationship of how India saw its diaspora, but also how its diaspora saw India. So the Indian government made a very courageous decision. They created a high-level committee that went out, spent a couple of years literally talking to the Indian diaspora. So the committee published a report. It's available online. It's about 700 pages long. Do not read it all. Do the old academic trick. Introduction, conclusion. It'll give you a sense. But that was a listening exercise that when they went back to India, they began to enact some reforms. Not huge, wide-sweeping reforms, but enough to indicate to the diaspora that they were listened to. Since the early 2000s to where we're sitting now in 2019, which is, not that long, 15 to 20 years, Prime Minister Modi had visited the UK and the US and Australia a couple of years ago as part of promoting the Make in India manufacturing program. At a cultural level, he sold out Wembley Stadium, Madison Square Garden, the Sydney Cricket Ground, full of the Indian diaspora for cultural celebrations. Now, let's not be naive about this. Behind the scenes, it was about trade and investment. So that shows how you earn the right of having the conversation with your diaspora to then begin to engage with them in a meaningful way to help you develop your developmental vision. So that's a story. I would argue India are slowly creeping to the best in the world on this. I want to pick up on something that I think is important for people listening to the podcast to try and understand, whether they're working in a government industry or so on and so forth. When we talk about diaspora, and we talk about wanting to tap them, wanting to harness them, that vocabulary breaks my heart. And there's a bit of confusion in the sector that I think people need to understand. And I think the India model captures this, is that, we talk about trying to get remittances into investment and trying to get capital from a diaspora member or just seeing the diaspora as the individual. Nobody wakes up in the morning with a natural inclination to give you their money. The world does not work like that. Right? And what diasporas can do before you get to the point of having the economic development discussion is that they can actually become key players through the institutions that they're working for. The key question you really need to understand and answer at the beginning is, why are we doing this? And, a lot of governments will give you the quick answer, economic development, but that's not a good enough answer. You need to know within economic development why you're doing it. And because otherwise the diaspora won't understand what the ask is. Because if you work on diaspora engagement with the government, it's going to cut across so many different ministerial portfolios. Ministry of Trade, Ministry of Land, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Ministry of Home Affairs. So when I say diasporize your policies, those internal ministries and their strategic documents should at least acknowledge diaspora, because we need to build relevance internally. And what you also need within this is high-level political support. That's the way it will grow in time from the government perspective. I think if we want to flip it, and we talk about people that are working maybe intergovernmentally, such as an IOM or civil society organisations or academics, there will come a time, and this might be controversial, where you might have to leave government outside the room for a bit. If the government is not delivering, and this is the private sector guy in me, leave them out, and see where that brings you. The only way we'll find it, and I'm going to be frank and open and honest on this. Most of the successful diaspora engagement that has happened in terms of scale as well out there has happened at most in partnership with government, but at a minimum in spite of government. I'm a big believer that to make diaspora engagement work, the first thing you have to do is depoliticize it. I think the moment you allow, and this is for the diaspora, this is for people that are listening that are members of diaspora. I want them to hear this message as well, is that the number one reason why a lot of diaspora organizations fail is that they're inherently political, and the political agendas of the people within the organizations overrun the purpose of the organization.
Why the other countries don't take advantage of the best practices you are mentioning on diaspora engagement?
The first thing is that they have to see it as an opportunity. The answer in terms of successful diaspora engagement may come through partnership of government with other organizations. I do not think government can do this alone, right? So the big question is, why are they not taking that opportunity? Here's the beauty of diaspora engagement. It's non-competitive, right? Somebody that wants to help India does not want to help Ireland. Somebody that wants to help Estonia doesn't want to help Egypt. So we can actually share as much as we want. So I'm a founding member of a group called CASE, C-A-S-E. And CASE stands for Copy and Steal Everything. Look at what other countries are doing, figure out how they've done it, and apply it to the local context. You can't do it in academia, it's called plagiarism. But in diaspora engagement, it's called being clever.
Listen, the other day you said diaspora engagement, it's not a sector yet. It's only a skill right now. So what do you think it should be done to have diaspora become a sector?
I think you have to train diplomats For countries that want to do this well, train your diplomats on diaspora engagement. So that's what we've been doing internally with our organisation, the Networking Institute. We've developed the first ever diaspora engagement training program, where we bring people through from start to finish. It's supplemented by a world-class academic bibliography. So if they want to learn about skill transfer, trade and investment, gender engagement, whatever they want to learn about, we have that access. So I think that's the first step in that process in terms of training people. You know, there's nowhere in the world that you can go and study diaspora engagement at an elite level. That tells you that it's not a sector. Any graduate that comes out that's relatively talented, or anybody that want to work within areas such as social innovation, social entrepreneurship, that wants to work within diaspora, we cannot tell them that this is an indicative career pathway for you. You know, you go talk to these people. They're just not there. So that tells you that this is not a sector yet. So I think that's the next frontier of the wider area, you know. And again, let's be honest, let's stand up for government here then. You know, government can't be expected to do that alone. You know, and my crazy vision for Ireland, you know, when people say it's a crazy vision, I think we'll achieve it in the next 5 years, if I'm being frank. I want Ireland to be established as a centre of excellence on the teaching, training and research on diaspora engagement. I think the world will beat a pathway to our door if we achieve that. So again, to achieve that, who do you need around the table? You need certain members of government, you need academics, research institutions, you need think tanks, you need civil society organisations. But who you really, really need, as the Spice Girls song once said, what you really, really want, we need the private sector.
Martin, you have stated that diasporas have the potential to be a positive force for migration. And this is a powerful statement. Why do you think so?
So look, the greatest potential we have on diaspora engagement at the moment is that it can be a positive force for migration. Because of the negativity that I mentioned around migration, that's nothing to be ashamed of, by the way, right? That's just the reality of the world that we live in. The beauty of diaspora is that many people do not understand what it means. So now we have an opportunity to shape the discussion on diaspora. And the beauty of diaspora is that, as I said, migration is the language of borders and identity and lines on the map. People see it as quite harsh. Right? It's about an us and a them. It's almost like a binary of us and a them. But diaspora being the language of affinity and belonging, diaspora communities can be used to desensitize those contentious issues. So it's about understanding that, you know, when we say diaspora, we can help people understand that, you know, these communities have started off as migrants, but now they're in their host countries and doing some really powerful stuff, whether that's at a community integration, cultural promotion, trade, whatever it is. So that's the opportunity for the sector. So that's how it can be a positive force. Firstly, by educating people on what it means, and then by leveraging that understanding to illustrate how that positivity has come to bear in their country.
And from Zagreb, Croatia, I'm Irma Ginaj with
Martin Russell.
And this is Hijrah Podcast. This podcast is produced by IOM MENA Regional Office.